Today we're looking at dnd-kit, a modern drag and drop toolkit built specifically for React. dnd-kit is incredibly lightweight. It's just about 10 kilobytes with 0 external dependencies. It feels like a true React library because it uses hooks like use-draggable and use-droppable. It's super performant. It supports all input methods out of the box, mouse, touch, and even keyboard controls. Accessibility is built right in. It's highly extensible, and it's packed with features that would take ages to build yourself. In this video, we're going to do a basic drag and drop, we're going to create a sortable list, and we're going to create a basic Kanban board that has multiple containers so that we can show how you can drag and drop within containers and between containers. If you'd like to follow along, head into the dnd-kit unboxed repo that I provided in the description below. Grab the URL, head to whatever directory you want to clone the repo in, clone it, and then open it in VS Code. Open your integrated terminal with Ctrl-J, run pnpm I to install the packages, and once your npm packages have been installed, go ahead and run pnpm dev, and you'll be able to open the running app on localhost 5173. Once you have the test app open, head to the examples directory under source and go into 01 basic drag drop. And this is where we're going to work on our first example. Import the dnd context wrapper, then wrap the component in the dnd context wrapper, and add a method that will be called when the drag operation has ended. This will be a placeholder for now. Next, we want to create a new component called draggable, and we will want to take this HTML, cut it, and return it from the draggable component. Add the component back in to the basic drag drop component, and then import the use draggable hook from dnd-kit core. We'll then use that hook in the draggable component, add the node ref to the div, as well as the listeners and the attributes. We then want to define a style that will be applied when the draggable item is being moved or transformed, and we'll update the Tailwind styles to look a little bit better. We'll also add the style attribute, and now when we hit save, we can drag the draggable item around, but we won't actually be able to drop it anywhere. Next, we want to add a new component called Droppable, which will contain the HTML for the drop area, and we'll use the use droppable hook from dnd-kit core. We'll then use this hook in the droppable component, pass the node ref setter, and update the styles of the outer div like so. Now when we save and we drag the component over, you'll see that the droppable area responds to it. Next, we'll import the use state hook from the React package, and in the basic dropdown above the drag handler, we'll add a isDropped and setIsDropped state setter, which will default to false. Then we can update the drag handler to pass an event as well as the drag end event type, which we'll need to import from dnd-kit core. Back in the basic drag drop component, we'll replace the contents of the drag handler with the following if statement, which is basically going to check if the draggable item was dropped over the droppable area. Then we'll conditionally render the draggable item in its original position when it's not dropped, and inside of the droppable area when it is dropped. However, we need to update our droppable component to accept the children and render them. So we add the children prop to the droppable, and we modify the span to render the children if children are available, or the drop here text otherwise. And make sure to get rid of this extra droppable component because we don't actually need that. Now when we hit save, we can successfully drag and drop the draggable item into the droppable area and vice versa. Lastly, we'll import the pointer within method from dnd-kit core and pass it to the collision detection prop on dnd context. This will allow us to check whether or not the draggable item is within the drop area based on the position of the pointer rather than the outer bounds of the draggable. And with that, we're ready to move on to our sortable list. We'll first import the dnd context, then we'll wrap the JSF with it. The dnd context will accept 3 props: the sensors, which are the input methods, the collision detection method, and what happens when the drag operation is over. We'll need to define a function to handle the end of the drag operation, which we'll call handle drag end. We will import the closest center method from dnd-kit core and use that as the method for our collision detection. And we will define a custom sensors object. Above the return, we'll go ahead and define our custom sensors first. We'll say const sensors, and we'll need a few hooks and classes in order to proceed. Up at our import statement, let's go ahead and add the use sensors hook, which will allow us to use multiple sensors. The use sensor hook, which will allow us to use a specific sensor. The pointer sensor, which will be used for mouse and touch operations, as well as the keyboard sensor, which will be used for keyboard operations. Then we'll use the use sensors hook, and in here, we'll then call use sensor twice. The first use sensor hook will accept the pointer sensor, as well as the following options. The second sensor will accept the keyboard sensor. Next, let's define our handle drag end function. This function will take in an event prop, which will be typed as drag end event. And for now, we will just console log the actual event. So we can go ahead and save this, head to sortable list, and nothing actually happens yet. However, before we move on, I actually realized that I made a mistake. We don't want to wrap the entire JSX in the dnd context, rather only the unordered list. So let's go ahead and fix that. Now we can save. Now, unlike the last example where we used the draggable, this time we want to use a different method called sortable, which is basically a similar version of draggable, but with a sortable index, as well as a sortable context. Let's import sortable context from dnd-kit/sortable. We'll also want to import the useSortable hook, as well as the vertical list sorting strategy. Then, down in our sortable list, right underneath the dnd context, let's add our sortable context. The sortable context will accept an items array, as well as a strategy. Make sure to wrap the unordered list in the sortable context, and then let's cut the list item and move it to a new component, which we will call sortable item. Sortable item will accept an ID as well as the content for that item, and will be typed as ID of string and content of string. Let's first return what we have copied. We can get rid of the key on the list item, and we can replace it with a ref. The ref that we're going to use in this case is set node ref, which we will need to get by using the useSortable hook at the top of the component. We will pass the ID to the useSortable hook, and we will get the attributes, listeners, set node ref, transform, transition, and the isDragging state. Right underneath the useSortable, let's go ahead and add a style to apply when the item is being moved, which we can do by using the transform property from the useSortable hook. Then let's pass the style to the list item, like so. And we'll also want to pass down the attributes and the listeners. Last but not least, let's go ahead and update the class for the list item so that when the item is dragging, it shows the following classes and otherwise shows these. Now let's go ahead and save, and you'll notice immediately we have an error. And that's because we are using item, which no longer exists, and we are not actually using the sortable item down in the list. We can fix that real quick. We pass down the item ID to the ID property and the item content to the content property. So now when we save, we can drag and drop our sortable items. Next, we want to import the array move helper from dnd-kit sortable, and then in handle drag end, let's start handling the drag event. We can get rid of the content that's in there, and first we can destructure the active state and the overstate from the event. Now let's check if an item was dragged over another item, and if so, we can update the item state. Now when we save and we drag and drop an item, you'll see that the position will be persisted in the state. Now we can import the CSS utilities from the dnd-kit/utilities package, which we can then use in our sortable item, which lets us use a built-in method instead of the conditional class string that we were passing in before. Now we can hit save, and let's go ahead and test out the keyboard navigation. So if you click on the sortable list text, hit tab, hit space, and now you can move things around with the up and down arrow keys, but you'll notice that you have to do multiple key presses in order to actually move an item up or down, and you can hit space to release. So let's go ahead and improve this. We'll first import the sortable keyboard coordinates from the dnd-kit sortable package, and then down in the keyboard sensor, we'll add the coordinate getter option and set it to sortable keyboard coordinates. So now when we hit save, if we go back to sortable list, click anywhere over here, tab onto an item, hit space to select it, and now when you use the up and down arrow keys, you'll notice that it completely navigates the item. You can hit space to release it, and you can hit escape to cancel the operation. Now what we have is fine so far, but we do want to improve our visuals a little bit. It would be nice to see a drag overlay before we drop an item. To do that, we'll import the drag start event, the drag overlay, and the unique identifier from dnd-kit core. Let's update the prop type for ID in sortable item from string to unique identifier, and then down in our sortable list, we'll add a new state called active ID and set active ID that will let us track which item is being dragged by its unique ID. Then, above the handle drag end function, let's add a new function called handle drag start. This will set the active ID based on the active ID from the event. Then, inside of handle drag end, let's start the process by setting the active ID to null, and then after we destructure over from the event, let's make sure that we escape early in the case that nothing is being hovered over. And because we're checking whether over even exists, we can actually get rid of it from this if statement. To use handle drag start, we can head down to our dnd context, and right above handle drag end, we can add the prop on drag start and pass in our handle drag start function. Then beneath our sortable context, we can add our new drag overlay. We can add a drag overlay with the following options. Within the drag overlay, we'll first check if active ID is set to something. We'll render the following markup. Otherwise, we'll render null. You'll notice that I commented out what the active item was over here. However, we need a way to actually get the current active item. We can do that by simply iterating over the item's object and grabbing whichever one matches the ID. Or if we want to be a little bit cleaner, we can actually define this as a function called getActiveItem and define that right above our return, like so. So now when we hit save and we try dragging an item, you'll see that there's an overlay and there's a placeholder indicating where it will be dropped. Now the classes are a little bit jarring right now, so let's go ahead and fix those. Up in the sortable item, let's update the isDragging classes like so, and the isNotDragging classes like so. So now let's go ahead and make sure that this looks good in light mode. So there you go. And it also looks pretty good in dark mode. Lastly, we'll add a drag cancel event, which will basically take care of setting the active ID to null when a drag event is canceled. So head down to our drag handlers, add the following drag handler, and then we'll add it to the drag context like so. Lastly, we do just need to update our sensors. And this is more as a quality of life improvement than anything else. We'll add a small delay so that we aren't dragging items while we're scrolling on mobile, as well as a tolerance. So now when we hit save, you'll notice that if I try to click and drag immediately, it won't actually drag. But if I click and hold, then I'll be able to actually move things around, which is really useful in situations where you're on mobile and you are scrolling past content. You don't always want to mutate the content that you're scrolling past. So now we're done with the sortable list example, and we can move on to the Kanban example. First, let's add the dnd context and configure the input sensors. Let's add the following imports at the top, and inside of the JSX, let's collapse this div and wrap it in the dnd context. Make sure to add the closing tag at the end, just like so. Now back up in the component, right under the container state, let's go ahead and define an active ID state, just like we did in the sortable list. Let's then configure our sensors and define our start, over, and end drag handlers. Then let's just go ahead and add them to the props. And to get rid of this error, we'll type void active ID, and this will keep our current TSX file problem-free. Now let's create a droppable container component right above the Kanban component, which will accept the following props and gets a set node ref from the use droppable hook after passing in the ID. We will have to import this from the dnd-kit core package. Next, let's head down to the JSX in our Kanban components return, and we'll cut the div and replace it with our droppable container component. The droppable container will need to take in a key, takes an ID of container ID, takes the title of container title, and items of container items. Then let's head back up to the droppable container component, and we will return the JSX that we cut from the Kanban component, like so. And make sure that you close out the component by adding a curly brace at the end. We don't actually accept the container object anymore, so we can actually get rid of it since we're taking the title and the items directly from the props. And lastly, all we have to do is replace the key with a ref, and instead of container ID, we'll just pass down setNodeRef. And then we can go ahead and save. And above the droppable container, we can create our sortable item, similar to what we did in sortable list. The sortable item will accept an ID and content, which is basically like the children that we were using in sortable list before. And for bonus points, we are going to close this function block earlier. Now we're going to need to import a few things from the dnd-kit sortable package. And back in the sortable item, let's just use the useSortable hook like so. We'll pass in the ID, and we'll take back the attributes, listeners, setNodeRef, transform, transition, and isDraggingState. We'll also want to import the CSS utility from dnd-kit utilities and define a style for the transition as we did before, just like so. Now let's head down to the droppable container, and we're actually going to grab the list item, go ahead and cut that, and back in the sortable item, we'll return it just like so. Let's remove the key and replace it with a ref of setNodeRef, add a style tag, and pass in the style that we defined above, pass in the attributes and the listeners, and we'll replace the styles with this conditional styles, just like so. Then back down in the droppable container, we'll want to wrap our unordered list with a sortable context. Make sure to add a closing tag underneath the unordered list closing tag. And inside of the items.map, we can go ahead and pass our sortable item and pass down the ID and the content to it. And lastly, just to resolve this error over here, we can get rid of the item.content and just replace it with content. And we can save, and back in our UI, you'll notice that we can now drag and drop things. Now we can drag things and we can drop things, but you'll notice that the order does not get persisted, and we're not able to carry things over into the other containers. To start getting the drag and drop functionality across containers working, we'll need to introduce a helper function called findContainerID. So head down to the Kanban component, and between the sensors and the drag handlers, let's go ahead and define findContainerID. And all this function is going to do is accept an item ID, and it'll help us find which container has the specific item. First, we want to find out if the ID is a container ID, and if not, figure out which container has the item. So now we can start using this logic in handle dragover. Let's replace the console.log with the following line to get the current active and over object with the following line. If there's no over element, we'll return early. Otherwise, let's grab the active ID and the over ID, and we'll use those IDs to find the container IDs that are associated with them. In the case that either the active container ID or the over container ID are null, we want to return early, but we don't want to do anything if we're dragging within the same container, because we're going to handle that with drag-end. So in that case, return early. If we're not dragging between different containers, we want to return early, and now we can start updating our state. First, let's figure out what the active container is, and if there is none, then we'll just return the state as is. We then want to find the dragged item, and if we can't find one, then we just return the state as is. Next, we'll create a new array with the item removed from the source container. If this is the source container, we want to go ahead and remove the item, but if it's the target container, we want to start adding the item. If we're just dragging over an empty container, meaning a drop area and not an actual item, then we can go ahead and return the state. But if we're dragging the item over another item, let's go ahead and figure out which item that is and update the state accordingly. If this isn't the target container, then we can just return the container unchanged and make sure to add a parentheses at the end over here. And finally, we can go ahead and update the state. And once again, make sure to add a parentheses over here as well. Now we can go ahead and save, and we can start dragging and dropping things between other containers. However, you'll notice that we're not able to actually sort between items. We can only drag and drop things between containers. To address the sorting, let's first import the array move helper from dnd-kit sortable. Then let's head down to the handle drag end function. We'll replace what's in here with this line to get the active and over item, and then we'll start handling our early returns. The first early return is if there is no over element and no active element. Next, we'll define the active container ID and the over container ID. And if there is neither an active container or an over container, then we can go ahead and return early. If we're dragging within the same container, we can go ahead and start handling the sorting. We'll first find the index of the container and return early if one isn't found. Next, we'll find the active and over items indices within the container. And if both indices are valid, we'll go ahead and move the item within the container. Otherwise, we'll set our setActiveID to null. Now let's go ahead and save, and let's test it out. And as you can see, we can start sorting between Kanban containers. Now, the last thing that we want to do is handle the drag overlay UI. Currently, you'll notice that there is no indication on where the actual item is going to be dropped other than a gap. We want to fix that so that it looks a little bit more like what we have in the sortable list. To do that, let's first import the drag overlay from dnd-kit core. Let's head down into the Kanban component, and right above the dnd context closing tag, let's add the drag overlay. And inside of the drag overlay, we're going to check for an active ID. If one exists, then we'll be able to render something. Otherwise, we'll just return null. Now let's go ahead and create that something that we will render in this place. Above the Kanban component, let's add a new component called item overlay. Now let's head back down to where we wanted to render something, and we'll replace this with the item overlay. However, we have an issue because we actually need to render something in this place, and that something is the current item from within the containers. So let's go ahead and create a new function over here. We'll call it getActiveItem, which will actually get the active item, and we'll specifically grab the content, because this is what we actually want to show. Now let's head back up into the component, and right above the return, we can go ahead and define getActiveItem, but because it can potentially return null, we actually need to add a question mark over here, which will just make sure that something actually exists. Now let's go ahead and save, and let's give it a try. So as you can see, there's a little overlay that you can basically think of as a preview for what the item would look like when it's actually dropped. Now, while we're down here, let's go ahead and add a drop animation to the drag overlay, like so. This will give us a nice little smooth transition between the time when an item is dropped and when it actually arrives in its droppable area. We also want to be able to handle canceling of a drag operation. So underneath onDragStart, let's add the following line, and we'll need to define the handleDragCancel function. So let's head up to handleDragStart. Right underneath it, we'll add the following function. We'll need to import dragCancelEvent. So let's head up to the imports and add it just like so. Now, while we're here, we do want to improve the keyboard accessibility, similar to what we did with the sortable list. So let's go ahead and import sortable keyboard coordinates from dnd-sortable, and then we'll head down to our sensors, and similarly to what we did with sortable list, let's go ahead and replace the distance with delay and tolerance, and add the following options to the keyboard sensor. Let's go ahead and save that. And now, if I click on the to-do, I can hit space, and I can use my keyboard to navigate not only up and down, but also between containers. And there you go. You have a easy, working, drag and drop solution for your React applications, and it's styled with Tailwind to boot, and you can go ahead and grab this code, use it, abuse it. Thank you so much for watching, and as always, I hope you learned something today.